Right, okay. I think we're live. Hello everyone. So my last video had sound issues, so please let me know straight away if you can't hear either of us, because I don't want to have that mishap again. Anyway, hi, I'm Katie Montgomery, and today I'm with Saint Eve. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. So I go by St. Eve in the internet spaces. I'm a cam girl, so I do sex work, a lot of naughty stuff online, and I engage with the atheist community a little bit.
And today,
Oh,
sorry.
and no worries. You'll find me on Twitter from time to time, kind of engaging in those like different topics.
And I think I've put her Twitter in the description below and also mine, so definitely follow both of us.
Mhm.
Yeah, so as you were saying, like you're a part of the skeptic community, and that's actually how we sort of became aware of each other, I think. So I saw
Mhm.
Eve on secular sexuality, which is a tongue twister, and I'm glad I said it right then. And it's also like a atheist community of Austin like spin-off show similar to the Atheist
Mhm.
Experience, which is a show I got invited on. You should go and watch the episode. And it was also a show that Eve was on, and I watched her episode because she was on like one of the ones before me. And
Mhm.
yeah, so that's like one of the things we have in common. And that's also what we're planning to talk about today, which is how like a skeptical position and a skeptical worldview has got us to our positions, both I think within our transition and also our stance on trans rights.
Mhm.
And this is kind of off the back of a show that I did last week on called Call the Line, where we had a caller who called in and asked a question about are skeptics skeptical of trans people, and it's like a bit of a controversial topic because I think traditionally the skeptic community has maybe or historically has had some kind of anti-feminist, anti-LGBT positions through ignorance, I presume.
Mhm.
And that's kind of something that both of us would like to address and maybe make sort of a case for the skeptical position on trans people, transition, and trans rights in general. So yeah, that's so basically. I thought what we could do is sort of discuss our journeys a little bit, and how we got in our transition, and then cover like I know Eve's got this massive list of topics she wants to cover, so yeah, just bring some up. But yeah, so I guess my first thing to say would be like how sort of when did you become like a skeptic, and how did that like inform your transition, I guess.
Sure. So I went to a private Christian school when I was a wee child. It was really intense. My home life wasn't particularly as pious, but the school was. So I grew up with a very indoctrinated religious kind of worldview and such. And as I got older, I think coming into like maybe like 8, 9, 10, that range, I started to become aware of at least the fact that I felt like not like I wasn't going to fit into their kind of mold. So I think I was able to drop the belief in God actually pretty young, probably like around 12 or 13. Um, but I held on to a lot of kind of sort of magical kind of feelings and like thoughts. Like I was into like kind of some like Eastern or Western Buddhism, kind of like, like yoga mom Buddhism kind of for like a
Right.
little while. Uh, yeah. I think as like that kind of progressed, I started to discover like my trans feelings a little more intimately and such. I think I think it honestly started from a place of bitterness. I think I was like going through like a lot of pain, and it kind of became clear to me that I was like, well, there's definitely no like higher design or like organization to the world because this shit fucking sucks.
Right.
um, so like, well, that's how the headspace I was in at the time, at least. And I think I didn't really take my skepticism seriously until maybe I started to get more college aged. And I think especially at the advent of like the Trumpian America and so forth, I think it became kind of clear to me that like these beliefs are not only like harmful, but they're really divisive. And it became imperative to me to kind of understand what is true and how do I know what's true, and like how can I decipher like these people who really believe this thing, but it seems so clearly wrong to me from like my own beliefs. Like, how do I know I'm not,
Right.
holding beliefs that are wrong?
I think that's like, so I guess I didn't really know if like the idea of being a skeptic as like a noun
Mm,
until really quite recently. But I think it's something that I've like practiced for a long time. And I guess for any
mm,
viewers who don't really know what we're talking about when we say like a skeptic or being part of the skeptic community or whatever it is kind of I think the classical description is I just want to know as many true things and as few false things as possible. And I think
mm,
that's just how I've always viewed the world, or at least that I remember viewing the world, is like with belief in God and stuff. I'm like, yeah, but is this true? Like, it's kind of nice in some ways, um, and that's then like that's was my entry into it, was like questioning God and particularly questioning about gay rights, because I'd been told that being gay was bad, and that's what I believed, and I did really believe it, and
mm.
then I just realized that was bullshit, and that kind of those two things happened at the same time, where I realized that you know being gay is just normal, and that kind of broke my belief in God, because I believed like if God said being gay was bad and he created gay people, then that would make him evil, and so that kind of broke all that down. But both of those are kind of skeptical approaches to um, is God real? Where's the evidence? Are gay people bad? Where's the evidence?
Right, right.
And for God position, I mean, a God, you can say, well, we don't have evidence that there's no God, but we have a lot of evidence like the Christian God isn't real.
Mm,
But for like gay rights, we have a lot of evidence to say like gay people are people deserving of human rights, and that sexuality is just something that people have, and it's not important, and it doesn't affect you, and fuck off. And so that there is a very strong skeptical case for you know all gay rights, I think. And yeah,
definitely.
sorry, I've deflected a little bit off your story there, but
No, no,
yeah.
that's totally fine. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think like, it kind of matters what your moral compass is centered on. If your moral compass is going to be, I'm going to follow this 2,000-year-old book, no matter what it says to a T, regardless of how that impacts the people around me or how, they impact others, then like, I guess by that definition, you're moral. But I think most people can see that there are a lot of claims in, religious fundamentalism, particularly Abrahamic faiths, that are like really damaging. They, a lot of them espouse like women as second-class citizens or
Hmm.
slavery, or like you were saying, that gay people are an abomination and deserve to go to hell. And I, I, I was fortunate enough to have a relative who was gay growing up, so it was able to create a little bit of cognitive dissonance in me to be like, but
Yeah.
he's so nice and he likes me. Like, how could he be,
There are
you know?
there are shitter people who are going to heaven than this gay
Yes,
person I know who is brilliant. Yeah, and I think that's the kind of thing that broke me. I was just like, why does it even matter? It just
right,
doesn't matter. I mean, it matters to them obviously hugely, and it matters to their loved ones and stuff, but to me, it doesn't matter if your uncle is gay or not. Like, it literally
right,
doesn't affect me.
yeah,
But for some people, it does affect them because they get offended by it. Yeah.
right.
Anyway, that's kind of like um, the the skepticism is where you are looking for what is true, and you can apply it to big questions like God, and then you can apply it to things like LGBT rights, and you can apply it both societally, so like what rights should gay people have, what rights should straight people have, but you can also apply it to yourself. And I know certainly for me, in much later on in my life, after coming to terms with being an atheist and also supporting gay rights and also being a feminist, it took me a little while longer to apply that to my own sort of inner feelings. and gender dysphoria and being a trans person. And I think that it's maybe more difficult in a sense when it's something that directly affects you. And it's difficult when, trans issues are quite difficult because there's just not much information about them. People don't know about them. You don't really meet trans people because there's so few of them. So it's harder to get that evidence. Like, are trans people normal? Well, the only trans people I know about are like the bad guys on Ace Ventura, and they're all terrible, disgusting. I don't want to be one of those. So that's it. That's all my evidence, and I don't have any counter evidence to that. And then as soon as you find it, you're like, it's quite a big deal. Yeah, I don't know if in your transition, like in coming to terms with your own feelings, like that like how you like approached it? Was skepticism instrumental in coming to terms with your own feelings, or?
I would say not initially. I think I think at first it was pretty clear. There was a lot of, I think, kind of conditioning from that intense religious environment that doing that thing was wrong. And I was like, well, I'm not a bad person. I'm not wrong. So I must not be that.
That's exactly how I felt about it. Yeah.
Right. And then I think as I became like maybe more like 12 or 13, like I became like a teenager, it became, the dysphoria feelings became really present of being like, I don't like, we were talking about this in the pre-show that I don't know that I necessarily thought like I'm a girl as a child, but I definitely knew that I was like, this life as a boy is not compatible with me, like, living comfortably. It feels very wrong. So I think it came from a very emotional place at first. I initially came out to my parents when I was, I think, 14. And then I went through some, unfortunately, traumatic stuff in high school that made me kind of afraid of being trans. I was like, oh, my life is just going to be like nothing but pain and challenge. Like I would rather just try to force myself into like at least something that works for society.
Just man up, mate. Problem
solved.
Right.
And I tried really hard. I when I got to college, I joined a fraternity, but the harder I tried.
So horrible. I don't know anything about American frat houses or whatever they're called, but like from what I know from films.
It's just as bad as you think it is, for sure. But in a sense, it was a good experience, I think, because it made it very clear to me, as the harder I tried to be male, the worse my mental health and the worse my ability to operate in society was, because I was a really good student, and like all of a sudden I was like failing classes and stuff, and I was having like dissociative panic attacks. I had been hospitalized a few times. And I think eventually I was old enough to like really critically ask those questions. Like, well, like I've had these feelings, I've explored them in the past, but like, how do I know I'm a woman? And that was really like, from there, the starting point of like, okay, well, I tried to be a woman. It was really hard, but I tried to be a man. And it literally does not work. Like I tried so hard and it does not work. So I have to really figure out like, how am I going to exist in the world? I think that's really where the more critical, skeptical questions kind of started from.
Yeah, I think one of the perhaps difficult thing for outsiders, or like just for cis people, I guess, is that often you'll hear like, oh, I have these feelings and my feelings tell me that this is the right thing to do. And it does sound quite a lot like, well, I feel God is real, or, well, I feel that I'm going to win the lottery. And it just sounds like garbage. And I think that sometimes that's like when something's presented to you like that, and that's your first association, if you spend all your time like hearing religious people say, well, I feel my God is real and I feel my God is real, and then you hear a trans person say, yeah, but I feel I'm a woman, you're just like, it's all the same garbage, mate. But right. I think the different, like what I would more say is it's not a feeling like, oh, I'm really feeling this. I'm feeling tonight, or I'm feeling like God is watching me or something. It's more like it's a feeling like when you're holding a pen with your right hand, if you're right-handed, and you try and write, it's fine. And then when you hold it with your left hand, it's just wrong. And like it's very hard to describe what that is. It's not just like, oh, I'm not feeling it. Like left's just not my vibe, man. It's like literally my brain is not wired in a way that left-handed writing works for me. Like I can kind of do it, and if I lost my right hand, then I could get by in life. No, I could do it, but it will be so much harder and more uncomfortable. And I would say to someone it feels wrong, but also it is like demonstrably worse for me. You can see if I try and write something with my right hand and I try and write something with my left hand, you can just see that the left-handed one is worse. You can make all kinds of predictions based on, if I say I'm a right-handed person, you can say, well, in that case, you're probably better at holding a tennis racket with your right hand, and you're probably better at like balancing stones on top of each other with your right hand and all this kind of stuff. And you can make these predictions. And transness or gender dysphoria or your gender identity or however you want to describe it is the same in that you can make predictions of it. And I think that's something that perhaps cis people who are trying to have this like skeptical approach to trans people might miss. And it's something that, so I'm trying to link so many different things here together.
It's a challenging topic to pull together.
I was just going to say also in like my own transition, I had these feelings, and I was aware of them, and I felt them all the time, in the same way that if you were holding a pen with your left hand, you were aware of it, and you can kind of get it out of your mind, but it would just be so much easier to use your right hand. Like you feel it all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like changing hands is the right thing to do. And there's so many things to think about when there's so many of these social barriers and stuff, and especially if changing hands requires thousands of pounds worth of medical intervention, then suddenly like you want to make sure that that's definitely going to be the right thing for you. So in my own transition, I tried to treat my own feelings as like kind of like a fact because they are there, but also compare them to all of the evidence of all these other people, more like a data point, and make a prediction based on the data.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's kind of a similar kind of thought. That was where like those critical feelings started. I think when I kind of was face to face with the fact that I still felt not okay in my body, I think I kind of thought about, okay, well, I'm in my 20s now. I've been vocalizing and, feeling gender dysphoric for like almost a decade now. And I've been feeling those feelings for even longer. And if I look at the research based on, transition, like efficacy, the efficacy of medical transition anyway, you can see that like the younger people start feeling those feelings, or at least that they think they feel those feelings, like the more likely they are to be satisfied with medical transition. So that was kind of like one of those areas where I started to be like, okay, well, I at least have like a data point here to work with and start building off of.
In the end, so I feel like this is a little bit all over the place, I guess. Thinking about making your own decision in deciding whether, I don't know if this is the best angle to come at it, but anyway, okay, making your own decision about whether you're going to come out and whether you're going to transition and stuff. You have your own feelings to go off of, and you have the data to go off of. And in a way, like your feelings are like an anecdote. They're like a single data point. And you can look at it and you can say, oh, well, people who had these feelings at this age and have had it for this long, there's like a 99+% chance that transition's right for them. And you can say, well, in that case, given that I match this data, there's 99% chance that transition's right for me. But that doesn't mean transition is right for me, because there
Right.
are people who fit this description who don't find that transition is best for them. So I
Right.
think that this is another perhaps where the political social campaigning for trans rights might stress some skeptics out a little bit. When someone says like, I'm trans if I'm saying I'm trans, full stop, fuck off. Like that's a position that lots of people hold, and I think that in day-to-day life, if someone tells you they're trans, then do just fuck off. But
Right. Yeah.
but then if you're doing this skeptic angle and you're like, well, actually, that's not technically true, because 99% of people who say they're trans now in 10 years' time will, but 1% won't. So how do you know? The answer is, I only know to 99% confidence, because I can only match my own experience to the data, and that's as best as we can ever do. And it's the same with all medical conditions and any other condition, like handedness. You can just see your own feelings, see the data, look at the odds.
Yeah, I mean, and this kind of builds off of, this kind of can tie back into what you were talking about your episode on the lion, where you were using the metaphor of like a headache or like a migraine or something. Like, sure, like you could be skeptical if someone says I have a headache, but like if they feel like they have a headache and there's probably a good chance that they're being honest about what they're feeling at least. And if they then take medicine and all of a sudden their headache goes away and they feel relief, like I think that shows that their subjective experience lined up with the data. They made a good wager based on the evidence that they had.
Exactly. I think that sometimes people hear like subjective and they think, oh, therefore it's nonsense. Like, well, your favorite color is subjective. I mean, I can make no predictions off that really. I mean, well, actually, I can. If you tell me your favorite color is green and I buy you like a green birthday card, you'll probably react better. But even then, I think that whenever I try and think about like my own transition, and also when discussing transition as like an option for other people, I try and look at it as like just a condition, and here are some treatments for the condition. And there's a good chance that these ones make people who are experiencing this thing better. And and it is like a headache in that someone can lie about having a headache. Someone could have a headache and they could have brain cancer, and paracetamol is not going to make them feel better, or it will for 3 hours. But in most cases, a headache is not caused by brain cancer, and it's not caused by someone lying about having a headache. I mean, I don't know the percentages, but paracetamol is going to make most people better. That's it. That's the data we have. And it's the same with transition. Most people who say, I'm a trans person and I would benefit from transition are that, because that's what the data is showing. But that doesn't mean they all necessarily are. That doesn't mean you should go around questioning everyone, because that's a different thing. That's like the social part of it. But from like just the skeptical view, it makes sense that looking at the data we have, that's what is the case.
Right. Yeah, I think I mean, I know some people maybe are uncomfortable with the like association of being trans with like a medical condition.
Right, that's the next thing I was going to bring up.
I mean, I think that is probably more of a like a narrative, like internal, like I don't want to be associated with like that kind of, rather than like necessarily them saying like what I experience is not a statistical like aberration and what most people assigned whatever sex at birth would experience. Like I don't think there's any trans people who are going to deny that like obviously most people are cis, like
so they claim. Like, what's the evidence?
True. Oh my God. Yeah, there's no evidence that staying on your,
Prove to me
well,
that you're a cis person or fuck
except
off.
for except for probably most of time. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
on the like the medical thing, I think that this is a really difficult tightrope to walk, and I guess
Mhm.
like it's also difficult to explain to the audience, which I think will be some trans people and some skeptical people and some people who like stumbled onto this out of nowhere. So there's quite a lot of things to explain, but when you are trying to access transition in most countries, definitely in the UK, you need a medical diagnosis from a doctor. And in
Mhm.
that sense, it is like legally a medical condition which has a medical treatment.
Right.
And that can be a useful way to look at it with the terminology medical condition, medical treatment. And certainly when I'm comparing it to like a headache, I can say, well, a headache is like a medical condition in a sense, and a paracetamol is a medical treatment. And I think to some people when they first approach this, that makes so much sense. They're just like, oh, it's a medical condition. Then we just need to give you a diagnosis or not. But then there's a whole like extra layer of complexity on top of this, which is trans medicalists, um, which so the trans medicalist position is basically being trans is a medical condition and transition is a medical treatment. And so,
Mhm.
like, from a skeptical point of view, that kind of makes a lot of sense because, well, all right, yeah. I mean, what's the problem with that? The problem is in practice, that often means that there, I mean, many trans medicalists will be people who have strict criteria that you must meet in order
Yeah.
to get treatment. And it often becomes a sort of an exercise in gatekeeping, like, oh, you've got a headache, but you can still drive. I don't think that counts as a real headache. You're not allowed a paracetamol. Fuck off.
Right.
And and like if you had a headache and you're like, well, I know I benefit from a paracetamol, and then someone's like, well, the doctor doesn't think you've got a headache. You have to wait 3 years to see a doctor and then prove you have a headache somehow. And that's usually like a consequence of transmedicalism, which then
Mhm.
makes the mainstream trans position opposed to transmedicalism. So a skeptic might, like a cis skeptic, might walk in and be like, trans people, okay, I've got my head around the fact that being trans is a real thing, but now they're all saying that it's not a medical condition. Like,
Right.
yeah, so I don't know if you have like a history traveling through that or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's still a space I'm navigating exactly how to approach. I have a few thoughts on it. I know you're familiar with Riley Grace Rochong. She's
Been on
got an
the channel
awesome,
twice recently, you should check it out.
yeah, she's got an awesome research document that, like, if people have questions about resources for defending transpositions, it's a great place to go. And I was checking that out at some point, like a couple weeks ago, I think, or recently. I'm not sure exactly when. And I really like the way she has articulated this about like, um, in a non-medicalized way, if someone like doesn't necessarily experience the dysphoria, to have that data point of like, oh, I've been experiencing dysphoria since so forth. If a child who is trans, assigned like male at birth, hypothetically, lives in a home with accepting parents who allow this child to just exist how they want to exist from birth, and that child never really experiences like traditional dysphoria, like that child is still trans and should still have access to medical transition.
Right, yeah.
um so like that makes sense to me, because I mean that's kind of like saying, like, if someone has like asthma, if they don't have like a asthma attack where they're collapsing on a field with like wheezing, that they shouldn't be allowed to have like an inhaler. And it's like, well, no, I mean, I'm sure like a doctor can like observe you and be like, yeah, I think you've got asthma, man, here's an inhaler just in case, like.
Yeah.
um and
Just reminds me of this crappy English advert from the 90s of like two boys, one of them like washes his face and the other one's like, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, it's to get rid of my spots. He's like, but you don't have spots. And he's like, that's because I use this. And he's like, well, why do you use this if you don't have spots? He's like, so I don't have spots. It's like,
right. Yeah. And I mean, I think this kind of comes back to, I think there are like, sometimes there are like narrative distinctions in people's personal identity. And then there are like I know, I think, I don't know if I said this in the pre-show or since we've been live, but then there are like those more material things where it's like, you have like the gender dysphoria, and there's research on that. And then, oh, fuck, I've lost my train of thought.
oh no.
Oh no, it got derailed.
We had, well, like we were talking for like half an hour before the show, and then I had some serious tech issues. I had blue screens, I had to change sound cards. It like totally fell apart. So it's like we were on a buzz, and then I totally derailed it all by failing with tech. And then we were like, well, right, we're live. Yeah, so I guess, so I'll just
take it in another,
so
derail me.
On like the medical condition thing, usually when I'm talking about it, rather than saying medical condition, which implies some diagnosis is necessary in order to even be trans, or in order to call yourself trans, I usually just say condition, like being left-handed or being right-handed is a condition of being human. I mean, I don't know if condition's necessarily the right word, but it's a state that some humans have. Some humans are better with the right hand, some are better with the left hand, some are better with both, some can't use either. And being trans, like, it's not a mental illness. It's not where something is, broken in your brain, whatever that means. It's a whole different argument. And it's not like a broken leg. It's just a state of being. And whether that's pathologized or not is kind of a political issue rather than an important one in seeing whether transition is good for people. Like, transition can be good for people whether being trans is a mental illness, a physical illness, a brain condition. It literally doesn't matter. Transition is good for people with these symptoms, regardless.
I think that's where I was trying to go. When I was saying like a narrative, that's what I was trying to, I think, get at, is that like how you define these things, whether you think of it as a mental illness or a condition or like a state of being or whatever, like that doesn't really matter. That doesn't make a difference in whether or not transition like benefits you or whether or not you're like a true trans TM.
Yeah. I think that this is something that gender critical people, so that's like the main anti-trans movement at the moment, I think that's a really common pattern in their thinking that I see. They'll say being trans is a mental illness with the implication like, oh, it's like you have lost your mind, like you can't be trusted, what you're saying is just delusional. There's something wrong with you. It's a delusion. And I mean, the obvious very quick answer to that is, well, it's not a mental illness. Here's what the World Health Organization says, here's what the NHS says, here's like, none of the experts think it's a mental illness. And they'll often then say, well, what is it then? As if that's important. Like, if it was a mental illness, maybe it's literally a delusion. Okay, well, it turns out that in this case, for this particular delusion, transition is a good treatment, and therapy trying to change their mind is demonstrably not a good treatment. We have a lot of evidence for that. So, I mean, okay, I'm mentally ill, I'm delusional. But, I mean, what does that do? It doesn't actually, which category of thing we call this isn't important in what's the best course of action for this person, this patient, or this friend or loved one or whatever. I think like gender critical people often, I mean, they love their black and white discrete boxes to put people in. If it's not a mental illness, what is it? Like, what kind of pathology is it? Like, man, it's just normal, just fuck off. But also it's not important, is what I'm saying. Yeah. Right.
I think, and you can apply that same reasoning to like literally anything that we call like a mental illness. Like, like it's just a recurring phenomenon that the human brain can be oriented in. It's just a way that the human brain can be. Yeah. And like for like things like like schizophrenia or like, you know, whatever mental alignment you want to go with. Well, not for everything, I guess, because we don't have infinite knowledge, but like for the things that we do know that we have measured, sure. um, yeah, but for the things we do know, like often one of the things we test for is what can we do to help this person? Like what is a statistically significant treatment that allows this person to exist in the world? Like I know the DSM will use like a lot of these things aren't technically a mental illness until they start interfering with your capacity to engage with like your relationships and your life and your work and all those things. Like those are like typically kind of the metrics that we use to define like what is significant treatment.
I mean, this is, I think this is a like philosophy of medicine topic in a way, in that what we call an illness, a disease, or a condition, or whatever, is subjective. Like something like a broken leg, we can objectively say, this is what a not broken leg looks like, and this is what a broken leg looks like. Which one of those is your leg? But even then, a broken leg is like a negative thing. It's a pathology because it stops humans being normal. And something like if you break a hair, like that is also objectively broken, but it's not bad and no one cares. And I think people kind of get caught in this idea that there's a true way that humans should be, and then there are all these like broken ways that you can be that we're trying to fix to get you back to the way you should be. And there's a lot of like sort of I don't know, it's not spiritual, it's not a right word, but it's very sort of like this philosophical idea that there's this state which is the real you, and you're just trying to fix a problem which has stopped you from being there. And so when you view something like transition, when you view something like a broken leg, obvious fix the leg, bones fixed, back to normal. Like you got a headache, take this pill. It must be a problem. Like the problem is that you're not normal anymore, but now you are because you've taken this medicine. Whereas with transition, you say to someone, "Oh, I benefit from medical transition." They'll be like, "But it's not normal." So now you're broken.
Well, I don't really care.
I know because they don't. I don't think that people realize when you're calling something a condition. Like, and a very common example that comes up is whenever they make some ridiculous sweeping statement like, all women are XX chromosomes, and you're like, well, I mean, before we even get onto trans issues, that statement is just objectively false. Or, well, it's, I don't know if objectively is the right word there. It's demonstrably false. Because here is a woman who isn't a trans woman who is XY. That's it. Your statement is false. But then they'll say, oh no, it's just a disorder. Something went wrong. That doesn't count because she is a woman. Like her mystical presence is of a woman and she's just broken in some way. And I think that's really degrading. And the reason that you'll say XX is a disorder, but you won't say like blue eyes is a disorder, it's just because of what you've decided is normal.
Sorry, completely. No. That's exactly the point I'm getting at, is that like, you know, this kind of comes back to when we say things like when you call something like biological sex a social construct, like you're not saying that there's not an observable phenomenon that's happening here. What you're saying is that the way we talk about and the usefulness of like the way that we talk about this is something that we as humans decide together. It's not like there's not an objective like sex. There's not like an objective sex that can be like it's we know that statistically most humans, their chromosomes are aligned a certain way, and up until now it's been useful to talk about them like this, but now we're finding that maybe it might be useful to evolve the way that we talk and think about these things.
Yeah, exactly, because we've just got more data now. I think that lots of people view they view biology like maths, and I mean whether maths. So I mean this is a separate philosophical debate about whether maths truly exists and whether it exists because we've discovered it, or it exists because we've invented it. But just that aside, within the scope of maths, we can make objective definitions, like strict definitions. We can say a square has 4 sides, 4 corners. The angles are all the same, and the edges are all the same. That is a square. That is literally the fully encompassing definition of a square. There's no other shapes that fit that specification that aren't squares, and there are no squares that don't fit that specification. It's fully comprehensive definition. And they just think that kind of definition exists in biology, and it just doesn't. And if I say to someone, right, we've got some arbitrary shapes, and I want you to tell me whether they are squares or not squares. We can, given the rules, given our understanding of what a square is, all of them we will agree on. There's just no room for disagreement at all, because we have these rules. Is this a square or not?
Right.
And when we come to classing humans into boxes, or any animal, or just anything in biology at all, rather than saying, well, this is a square, what we're saying is, oh, here's a load of patterns that we've seen, and they're all, it kind of looks like this, so we'll draw a box around this.
Right.
And we'll give it a name. And we'll draw a box around this, and we'll give it a name. And then when you find something that doesn't quite fit in, then you make a decision. Do we have a new box? Do we extend this box? Do we claim it's an anomaly and we've got a bad measurement? Like, it's very difficult to decide what to do. And yeah, sorry, rambling off again.
No, that's great. I think it just kind of comes back to like just this idea that like people think that when someone is claiming they have a trans identity or they feel like a woman or something like that, that it's no more than a claim of like, well, I feel this way, therefore, and it's just not the case. I think it's usually has to do with them. I don't think there's almost any trans people who don't go through a long period of doubting whether or not they're trans, who, most of us try to force ourselves to desist.
In an afternoon, then I strongly suggest you reconsider, because
Right, exactly. And most trans people would say that, like, hey, like maybe you are trans. I don't know. I'm not you. I'm not in your head. I don't have your experiences. But like, if you were just deciding, like, I think it might be worth a little bit more investigation, and comparing that to the information that we do have. And and we could in 10 years have a completely different set of data and information, and this could be a topic that like you and I may have different perspectives on, or it might be evolved in a different way. There might be easier ways for people to understand whether or not they're trans. It's really hard to say because we really don't have much data on this stuff. And the data that we do have is honestly not that great. Like I know a lot of trans meds love to talk about like trans brains and stuff, but when you look at a lot of the like measurements for the areas that are quoted as being gendered, like there's overlap between cis men and women in a lot of those regions. So I'm like, you could have a female brain and still be a cis male. So like, I don't find that stuff particularly useful.
All of those studies are like, we analysed the brains of 6 people, and here are the results. And like,
right, exactly.
I mean, that's great. We've got 6 more data points, but So just on the, I think one of the questions that a lot of cis skeptical people might have in their mind of this kind of, when I say I'm trans, fuck off. When I say I'm a woman, fuck off. The way to look at it, I guess this is kind of what we've been talking about for the whole time so far, is it's not that when someone says they are trans, that's what makes them trans. That's not the action. That's not like a cause. When, if someone one day says they're a man and the next day they say they're a woman, it's not the action of saying it or thinking it that makes them that thing. What it is that the best way to find out whether someone is trans or not is to ask them. That's the most reliable way we have. And it's the same with a headache. The most reliable way we have to find out whether someone has a headache is to just ask them. And they can lie. They can be wrong.
Right.
But generally, that's not the case, and we just don't have a better way of measuring it. Um,
Yeah.
and that's what we're saying. Like, that's the skeptical angle on this. And for sure, you'll meet trans people who say, because I say I'm a woman, therefore I'm a woman, and that's that. Perhaps they're not taking the skeptical angle or something, but that's the position they're kind of communicating is, well, I know better than you do. So.
Right. Yeah. I was just going to say exactly that. I think most of the time when people say that, people who aren't trans think that, like you just said, like they're saying that declaration alone is
It's
the
like a
key, but
spell. Yeah.
right. But no, they're just, most of the time they're just communicating that if they were going to prove to you that they were trans, they would have to convey their entire life story. And why the fuck would they give someone who's being an absolute asshole like the time of day to go through their whole life story to like to demonstrate that, when most likely if they did, this person probably wouldn't care and they would be like, well, you have the magic chromosome, so I don't believe you anyway. Like,
I am assuming that you have XY chromosomes and therefore you're a man.
yeah. Right.
Oh, well, if you're having to assume them, they must be really important to your life. Yeah. So I guess we started talking about your story and my story, and then we kind of deflected off it and talked about like working out like your own transition and also viewing other people saying they're trans as like a statement from the skeptical angle. Another thing I wanted to cover was like trans rights from the skeptical angle. I know we're trying to cover a lot of ground here, but are you okay to move on to that?
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
So when you yourself are working out whether you're trans, I think you can be skeptical about it, and you can look at your own experiences and compare them to the data we have, which, like you say, it's not as good as the data on what causes headaches, but we do have a lot of data. I mean, we have decades of data, and you can talk to thousands of people. I mean, I literally talk to thousands of people in coming out. And then it's the same when you're trying to understand someone else as a trans person. You can, like an individual, if Eve says she's trans, I've got to believe her because why else? That's the only sensible position. But then trans rights is a whole separate category, because you could say, okay, I agree that some people were born in a way which means they benefit from one or more of the following treatments. I mean, that's the most like abstract way of saying it. There are some people who are born who will be happier if they had genital reassignment surgery, and most people will be significantly worse off if they had genital reassignment surgery. They won't be chill with that at all. If you just, don't try it. But like, they have tried it, and there is evidence where they've done it to people, and it's really horrific. But that, all of that is a separate topic about whether trans women should be able to use the toilet with cis women. Like, that's a totally different topic. You could accept all of the transition stuff and then just say they're just a man with some weird condition, so therefore that means nothing, and the facilities are for women. And I think when you approach trans rights from a skeptical position, you also do get to what I think is the best position, but it's for a whole different set of reasons.
I think it's still largely based in research, though.
For sure, exactly.
Yeah,
that's kind of the point I'm making. Yeah,
right. I know there's been at least one study, I believe, that has looked at like claimants of like sexual assault or violence happening in women's restrooms and who the perpetrators were, and they've like been able to see that at no point, and like whatever the period of the time of the study was, I don't know it off the top of my head, that like none of the assaults were trans women. And I think they've done self-report surveys of trans people that showed that trans people have been assaulted in the bathroom of the gender with which they identify. So it's kind of an absurd claim to me that people would say, men are inherently violent, trans women are men, therefore trans women shouldn't be allowed in a restroom. But also, like, as a skeptic, if 10 years down the line, we got a whole new batch of data that said like trans women happen to at disproportionate rates assault women in restrooms,
Let's say
and they're
half of all assaults in women's restrooms are from trans women. Then my position would be, we need to do something different.
yeah, I would completely change right there. I'd be like, oh shit, that's bad. Like, I don't want to perpetuate this issue. Let's find a solution. Now, I don't think the solution would be force trans women to use the men's restroom or something absurd like a lot of gender criticals would like.
I mean,
yeah,
potentially, I guess it's like the sort of atheist position on God. I mean, it's the Russell's teapot thing. Potentially, there's a teapot orbiting around the moon. I mean, potentially there is a set of evidence out there which would say trans women should be in the men's toilets. It's looking very unlikely. You're going to have to provide me with that evidence. I actually think that we're probably at a case where there's no evidence, like there will be no evidence for that. Certainly with like, I mean, for example, in the UK, we've had self-ID, which, you know, you yourself choose which facilities are best for you, legally protected fully since 2010, partially since 1999, and before that was no regulation at all. So trans women have always used women's facilities here in the UK. And I mean, from that decades of like data we have, there's not a problem. And if there was a problem, all of the anti-trans campaigners would be highlighting it. But statistically, there's not a problem.
Yeah.
But like on what you said about the classic argument is men are more dangerous, assertion 1. Trans women are men, assertion 2. Therefore, trans women should be in the same category as men and kicked out of the women's spaces. I mean, that on its own is a logical fallacy because saying trans women are men, isn't saying trans women are cis men. Like, you could put them both under the category of men if you wanted. I mean, that you could create a set of definitions that did that, but that wouldn't be saying that they are the same group as cis men, which are the other subset of men.
Right.
And that's, I mean, this is maybe a bit of a crummy analogy, but that's a bit like saying lions kill people, lions are cats, Poppy is a cat, therefore she's dangerous and shouldn't be in my house.
Right.
Like, she is a cat and a lion is a cat. Like, we can say that. We can make that definition. I mean, we don't have to make that definition, but it's a definition we can make. But it's a ridiculous assumption to say these two groups are the same in behaviour and same in all of the other aspects. And we have to treat them as separate groups. Because, I mean, they are separate groups. Or we wouldn't be talking about them.
Right.
So that's like on the sort of the facilities argument is, you know, we do have these data. The main argument for kicking trans women out of women's spaces is just they are men, and like whether that's true or not doesn't actually matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think in like going forward, I guess the other area of like trans rights is often in regard to like healthcare. And honestly, you can use the exact same evidence for why a person is trans and why trans is a real phenomenon that you know needs to be treated. Is that like we have data that shows that statistically, people who claim to be trans benefit from medical I guess maybe not necessarily medical transition, but transition generally.
There's transition's a whole selection of things,
right?
And loads of different aspects, and some people benefit from some of them, some people benefit from others, most people benefit from all of it. Yeah, and it then again is the same with facilities and various other categorizations, pronouns, all this kind of stuff. We can look at every single one individually. Do all trans women benefit from genital reassignment surgery? No. Do all people who fit this particular set of symptoms? 99%? We can make a very good prediction here. Do all trans women, do all the people in the world who call themselves trans women want to and are most safe using the women's bathrooms? No. But the ones who fit a certain set of, we can make a prediction based on the data we have.
Oh, sorry, I whacked my headphones out.
That's all right. We can make a prediction based on a certain set of criteria, and they do benefit from that. It's basically the skeptical way of looking at it, I think.
Yeah. Oh yes, right. I was gonna say, also like, you know, I know a lot of people, the argument is like, well, we don't, it always comes from ignorance, I think. And maybe I'm straw manning, so if I am, feel free to call me out on it. But the argument against why transition should be covered by healthcare usually has something to do with you don't know for a fact it's going to help, and therefore we shouldn't be forced to give that monetary aid. But I think we've kind of said this in multiple ways already. That's true for literally any condition ever. You can't be sure that any conditions, the typical treatment is going to be effective. But the whole point of health insurance is that you are born into a country and a system against your will. And so we offer these services, to cover the various things that can happen. And we use the best evidence that we have to say, okay, this thing is probably going to be the thing that best benefits you in your particular situation. So that's what we're going to cover. And I think if these people were logically consistent with their objections to trans coverage in healthcare, they would have to also object to literally basically any treatment. And at that point, it's kind of absurd. Why would healthcare as a system even exist in the first place if it's not covering things that are medically necessary?
Trans healthcare is unremarkable in every single metric, apart from the fact that people are irrationally upset with it. Right. It has a lower regret rate. I mean, for example, the example that I always give is the regret rate for transition is 0.5% at most. And the regret rate for knee surgery is up to 20%. And we still, if you needed, if your dad said, I need a new knee, and then the doctor said, no, sorry, the regret rate is 20%. What's wrong with it? It's nonsense. Who cares?
Right.
Fix people's knees. And it's the same with everything. There are side effects to transition, and some of them can be really serious, but they're not as serious as some everyday treatments. And there are risks, and some of the risks of some of the treatments for trans people are really horrible, but they're not as horrible as some other things. And all of it, actually, just from statistics, ignore the emotional attachment to all of it. It's not that big a deal it's not a remarkable treatment. It's a big deal, but it's not a remarkable treatment. And I think if you were, like you say, I mean, if any anti-trans people were consistent, which literally none of them are, in experience, if you were actually consistent with saying, oh well, actually, I don't think transition should be a thing because it's got a 0.5% regret rate. Well, it's well, if you want to get rid of 0.5% regret rate treatments, mate, you're going to be wiping out 10% of all medical treatments, and a lot of people are going to be very upset with you. And I think once you start and that does generally apply to lots of things with trans people. If you start saying, maybe you have some data that says in your country trans women commit 2 times the amount of assaults in women's bathrooms than you would expect, then okay, should we look at some other groups which commit assaults in women's bathrooms at 2 times? Is that really a consistent position you want to hold? I mean, an example which it's hard to word in a way that it's not so derogatory is left-handed people are more likely to be incarcerated for certain crimes. They're overrepresented in prison for a lot of different crimes, and I don't think they're underrepresented in any crimes. Does that mean left-handed people are inherently more dangerous? Is there some kind of social pressure? Should we be banning left-handed people from women's bathrooms? It's just not. It's not a position I think people consider to be consistent, because when they first approach trans rights, they're oh, these men want to be in the women's bathrooms.
Mm.
But they should be saying, here is a group of people arguing to carry on using this thing that they already use. How does that compare to other groups that do that?
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if there are any other areas of like trans rights particularly that we're like missing. I know we're also kind of like, I feel like vaguely gesturing at a lot of like research. I definitely, like, again, reiterate, like Riley Grace is a great resource. There's the research is definitely out there, and I have read most of it, but like I don't have all the papers in front of me. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of like, all the research that's been done on trans people. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that lots of the arguing that I do on Twitter, which is where I live, lots of it you don't need to get as far as presenting the papers sometimes, and that's not like some lame like cop out like, oh, who needs evidence. It's that someone will say, I think transition should be banned because like up to 1% of people regret it. And like, okay, I'll take your figure of 1%. I'll take your figure of 10%. That's fine. Are you now saying that if I go and look at all the medical conditions with a regret rate of 10%, that you want to ban all of them? And that's the argument I'm presenting. I'm not saying there are any others. I'm not saying that transition, I'm not conceding that transition has a regret rate of 10%. What I'm saying is, are you about to make this assertion? And they never will.
Yeah.
They never do. Because that isn't their argument. Their argument is, I don't like it.
Right, exactly.
But they're trying to make it sound rational. And so when, if you were arguing from scratch, we need to support trans people, and here is all of the evidence, for sure, like, that is the position you should take. I've read through so much papers and people's arguments and all this kind of bullshit when I was coming out to myself. But when you're approaching people and they say, we should stop this, and you're like taking a skeptical position, often there's a logical fallacy before you even need to get to the evidence to support the premises. Like, two of your premises conflict. It doesn't even matter whether they're either of them are true or not, because they're a contradiction.
And I think that is also another reason why we aren't going into maybe necessarily the minutia of like studies, because I think it's more compelling for people to understand where the arguments against it break down, because I think that's more emotionally compelling for an individual. I think if you already are starting with the presupposition that I don't like trans people are men, or whatever kind of anti-trans position you're starting from, it doesn't matter how much research I hand someone, they're most likely not going to be, it's possible, but most likely they're not going to be very compelled by those numbers. I think when you show them that their position isn't well evidenced, that's when you can start like showing like the research and the data and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. Like, when someone makes an argument, you don't have to make a counter argument. You can often just say, well, your argument's false because of this inconsistency. We need to break down your whole total bullshit, really, before I present a counter argument. Especially if you are the one arguing to take away the rights of tens of thousands of people in this country, literally millions of people worldwide. You're saying there are millions of people in the entire world who do this thing every day, and you want to take that away from them. And your argument is logically contradictory, and you want me to provide studies. Like, we need to back off a little bit, because first, your argument is bullshit, internally inconsistent. Secondly, you have absolutely no evidence for any single one of your premises individually. Thirdly, the position you thought about is immoral. And fourthly, is the point where we can start getting to me presenting my evidence.
Right. Yeah, definitely starting with the statistics and those parts of the research and the data is not necessarily useful if we're like kind of trying to provide people with like how to approach this from a skeptical angle. Yeah, I think it's important to first demonstrate, how the things that they already believe, because they're probably going to be pretty convinced by the things that they already believe. So like demonstrating how those break down is a lot more compelling on an individual level than necessarily being like, well, but the study shows that the efficacy of medical transition is like whatever percent. Like that's, yeah, when someone's starting with that precept, it's already gone.
So when I like would say I'm a skeptic, I mean obviously all humans have their own problems, but I like to think if someone showed me something I said and something else they said that was a logical contradiction,
Mm.
the very least that I would do is go away and think, not these two things cannot exist at once, so at least one of them
Yeah,
is false. But
right.
people in general don't do that. And they'll say
No.
something like, here's one from today that I encountered. Someone who is saying, I can always tell who is trans and who isn't trans. Always. Like, it's easy. Anyone can tell. Assertion
Uh,
one. Assertion two. When a trans person tricks someone into having sex with deceiving them, it's rape. And like, okay, well, both of these two things are claims. You're making two claims,
right.
and we can actually address both of them, and they're actually both bullshit. But together, they can't exist. Like, can you just
Right.
explain to me how you can always tell, but sometimes you get tricked into sex with trans people? How does that work?
Yeah.
And
Right,
they just
exactly.
they won't have it. I mean, I've encountered, I mean, well over 100 people who have made those two assertions together. Um, how have you not? How do you
Yeah,
not think about this? It's so frustrating.
right.
Um,
I think it's hard too because like I tend to be, I feel like my natural personality is that I like to build bridges. I want to like communicate with people who I disagree with and try to like kind of like get them to like either convince me that they're right or to convince them why I'm right.
hmm.
But it does become hard because you get into those positions where people are holding on to logical contradictions and there's not much you can do with that point, except for like you if you've pointed out that it's a logical contradiction and they're still holding on to it. I feel like I don't know that's at that point it's best to just kind of take a step back and be like
It is
reserve your energy.
it is best to stop then, but I'm the kind of knobhead who can't stop. And someone, so I'll just try and break it down more. And I find the point, like, we'll just walk back to the bit where we agree. There's a point where we're going to agree, and I'm going to find it. And then I'm going to build you up one step at a time to the point where you realise these are logical contradictions. And suddenly it's
Right.
18 hours later, and I'm like trying to tell someone how, like, you agree that A can't equal not A. Is that not correct? And they'll be like,
Yeah.
and everyone else is like me, like this is the rest of your life, and I'm like, yeah, but yeah,
But it's important because these things do like affect trans people, like especially now more than ever. The past like year has been really awful for the past few years have been really awful for trans rights broadly, and like it's hard not to become emotionally invested in fighting these fights because like while for them it's another day on Twitter, their
yeah,
life
it's a
is
debate.
the exact same.
Yeah,
For us, it demonstrably affects how we interact with the world. Like I just had like an issue with getting like my license after moving, like literally this week, because the system is not built to support trans people having identification at all. So it's like these things have demonstrable effects on our life, and it makes sense why we get emotionally involved in these arguments and all that.
and for
It's
sure, and
definitely hard to navigate that space.
I think that. Oh wait, first before I say this, we've been talking for an hour and it's been amazing. I think it's been a little bit all over the place. I don't know how well I've managed to stay on topic because it's been all over the shop. But if anyone in the chat has questions for Eve or for me,
Yeah, I would
mainly
love
for
to have
Eve,
questions.
then please write your questions now and tag me in, and I'll have a look in a sec. But one like kind of final point on what you've just said there that I was going to say is that I think that a lot of skeptical people perhaps will see it like, well, if there's like a heaven and a hell, then it really does affect me and I really need to know. So please can you provide me with evidence? And then when perhaps a religious person might get upset in being confronted with their like, well, prove it. You're living your life this way and you haven't got any evidence for it. Prove it to me and to yourself, or stop. And they might get personally offended as well as, you know, the heat of the moment and stuff. And I think maybe skeptical people in general I don't know, I certainly do this, kind of find it easy to just kind of dismiss that, because it's like, well, yes, I don't want to upset them, but at the same time, what they're saying, what they believe in, has a negative effect on their life, and
Yeah.
I should explain that. But I think it can then be quite easy to be a skeptical cis person and come in with this, like, you know nothing about trans rights. You walk up to some random trans person, you'd be like, prove why you should be able to go to the toilet to me. I'll change my mind. And it's so, I mean, perhaps a religious person would disagree that these are in different categories, but whether or not heaven and hell exists potentially is very important.
Right.
But it's not important right now when I need the toilet. I need the toilet right now, and I want to go to the one that I always go to for the last X years of my life, and you're demanding that I prove it to you. Like, no. Piss off. Go and talk to some people who actually want to talk about it. Come to your stupid opinion in your own stupid time. Yeah. Anyway, that's what I was going to end on. Yeah. So let's just see if we've got any questions. This is where we have no questions.
Nobody cares about us.
Oh, disappointing. Come on, team. What are you saying? That's
okay.
All right. Well, you're just a really shit guest. So.
Oh, geez. I mean, like, I definitely understand that this is all over, because, like, on the topic of trans, I mean, it would be the case if we were trying to argue, justifying literally any sort of condition from a skeptical position. We'd be trying to weave together a massive load of, like, evidence and points together to explain why whatever common objections are wrong. So I understand that it's probably maybe hard to, maybe I'm being, like, arrogant, and it's not at all hard to track, but it does kind of feel like it's hard to necessarily follow the through line of all these different points.
For sure. It's very hard to know where to start in explaining it. Like, if someone said to you, I don't believe in right-handed people, prove to me that right-handed people exist, that you should be legally allowed to use a pen with your right hand, and that right-handed people deserve the same rights as everyone else. Go. You're like, well, I don't know where to start with this. I just live my life, don't I? Like,
I just am right-handed, like,
which is why, I mean, for a lot of trans people, that is as far as the argument's ever going to go, because lots of people just aren't interested in thinking about this. Why should every single left-handed person know the biology, the philosophy, the law of
the psychology?
Why should they have to? They shouldn't have to. If you are someone who wants to challenge that position that they hold, I mean, maybe if they want to engage you in conversation, it's important. And if they're part of some, like, cult which gets thousands of dollars from the government, then maybe you want to talk them out of it if you think it's wrong. But, like, some random person who's left-handed doesn't need to justify the concept of left-handedness to you.
Yeah,
and it's
right, exactly.
It's the same with being trans. It's, for sure, the government does pay thousands of dollars towards trans people, in the UK at least. And some of that might be your tax money. And whether someone's trans or not, if they're wrong about it, it could ruin their life. So that does have that kind of parallel with religion or astrology or any other kind of, like, belief system. But it would be foolish to say that it was just that when it's got this, like, conditioned side to it, where, the government spends thousands of dollars on people who have headaches, and thinking you have brain cancer when you don't could ruin your life. So
I think a lot of this, honestly, is rooted in the fact that we're living in a really weird time where I feel like maybe I'm wrong. Maybe acceptance of science is better than ever, like, over, like, all of history. But it feels like we're in a time where people are really, like, denying science, because you're right. No, not trans people shouldn't have to have an education on psychology and like you're saying, all the insane amount of factors that go into how and why someone might experience the world as like a trans person. Yeah, and it's unfortunate, but we're living in a time where science is so not accepted that it is the case that trans people kind of have to have an education on biology and psychology and sociology and anthropology and like all of these different things that like play into
the stuff that I've had to learn. My least favorite, and one topic we haven't covered on, perhaps I'll have you back for a part 2, is sport. And like, I have some opinions on trans people in sport. I do not give a shit about sport. The sport that I am most into is like Street Fighter. And there's people will argue about whether that's even a sport. So like I don't actually care, but now I know that orbital ridge fractures are common in UFC for women. And I know that like, you know, all this kind of bullshit that I just not only am I not interested in it, I hate it. I hate having to read up on Ultimate Fighting Championship women's injuries. It's horrible. I don't want it at all.
Yeah.
But when some dickhead is coming at me saying all trans women should be banned from all sports because Fallon Fox broke someone's skull, I'm like, okay, well, what's the truth behind this? What's the statistics behind this? So utterly tedious. But I am an expert. Well, not an expert. I'm knowledgeable in all this wank that I don't want to know about.
It is unfortunate because I'm also like, I hate sports and I don't want to know. I don't care. I'm not literally zero interest in the topic. But part of the reason why like I feel like I'm compelled to analyze these things from this perspective and to be knowledgeable on these topics is because like I don't want the next generation of trans people, you know, I don't want like we kind of talked about this in the pre-show. Like I used to have some like internalized maybe transphobia towards other trans people because of how hard my experience is or was. But I don't want other trans people to have to go through what I did. The whole point of having these discussions and trying to navigate around these topics is so that future trans people can not give a fuck about sports and just be like, I just like playing the violin. That's really all I want to do. I don't want to have to know psychology and biology. Like every other fucking person. Like it would be great for it to be not a big deal at all. But unfortunately, because people deny science and want to make our lives harder and more difficult, it is a big deal. And we do have to care about these things and think about them skeptically and learn how to navigate these really hard and sometimes like triggering conversations. And it's really unfortunate.
Yeah, definitely. I would have more to say on that, but we do have some questions now. So
let's do it.
So from Cold and Grey 12, what makes you both hopeful for trans folk? What makes you hopeful? Do you have any hope at all?
You know what? I would actually say at the beginning of the year, not much. I feel like broadly speaking, not necessarily always the case. I feel like recently there's been a lot more unity in the trans community than I'm used to. Like, I feel like trans people are starting to realize like, hey, you know what? We're all in this fucking game together. Like, if one of us goes down, we all kind of go down with the ship. So we need to like start working together a little bit. I think
she got tangled in the cable. Sorry. Yes.
As cats do.
I think that this year has been pretty intense. There was one week in particular. It was the week when J.K. Rowling came out as a transphobe. Then Donald Trump announced that he was going to take away healthcare for LGBT people. Then in the UK, they announced they were going to try and ban trans women from the women's toilets. And like, that was horrible. That was one of the worst weeks of my life. And that kind of sounds bullshit because it's just politics stuff, but it was so overwhelming. And I think that the trans community is very fragmented and we all hate each other and we all have strong opinions about each other. But, I mean, hopefully perhaps this kind of pressure does unite people. I'm always worried that there'll be a point of pressure where I will leave the country and disappear and give up on other trans people, and I feel guilty about that. I
Yeah.
have nightmares about that sometimes. And I do think there is a point where that happened. Like, if in the UK they did try and ban trans people from the women's toilets, like, if that actually came in, I would just leave the country. I mean, I'm rich enough to do that. I'm privileged enough to just go blend in somewhere else or just change my name again and no one will know who I am.
Yeah.
Um,
I totally resonate with that.
yeah.
Oh my God, especially with the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to our Supreme Court. Our marriage equality is they're talking about bringing it back into consideration. And then there's, I believe, I could be wrong on this, so if I am, don't quote me, but I believe I heard that there is a case regarding religious freedom on whether or not LGBT people should be allowed to adopt children,
Right.
whether like
Yeah.
adoption agencies should be allowed to discriminate.
Well,
And
actually,
like
in the
being a
USA,
mother is one of the biggest things that one of the biggest dreams I've had. If that gets taken away from me, like it's going to be really hard to stay in the US and fight for that when I'm
right.
like, I know I'm only 24, I'm young, but I feel like I've been fighting this fight for a really long time and I'm kind of exhausted. I'm kind of over it. Like, yeah,
Yeah. No, I feel that so bad. I was watching some interviews with Polish activists because I don't know if you've seen what's going on in Poland at the moment, but it's really bad. Basically, 2/3 of the country has announced that it's a no LGBT zone, and it's got like the backing of the politicians, and like they're very, very religious there, and they had a pride protest recently. I'm not sure which city, like a major city, had a pride protest, and like just a load of literal out and out Nazis turned up. The police backed them up and they burnt all the pride flags, and it was like, it's pretty grim. And seeing these, like, so many Polish people have fled to the UK and other surrounding countries, LGBT Polish people, and then seeing interviews with the ones who've stayed behind saying, well, I'm going to fight it for as long as I can, and like, that's incredible. And I'm in absolute awe of these people, and I do my best to fight for LGBT rights, but I will break long before these people. Like, if they're announcing no LGBT zones in the UK, I will be gone years before that happens.
Yeah.
And yeah, anyway, the question was what makes you hopeful. So I am hopeful that gay rights had the same struggle as trans rights, and although they're kind of on the edge again, I do think that social acceptance is at the point where hopefully they're not going to go backwards. And it took 10, 20 years for gay rights to have its peak in the bullshit media and then tail off. And I'm just hoping that gay rights are coming into pressure now as a symptom of trans rights having its rise and fall. We're probably still on the way up for trans rights, but it just can't last forever. The science and the facts are behind trans people. There's growing support. Like, there's only so long you can hold this bullshit off. I mean, decades. People can deny this kind of stuff for decades, but they can't deny it forever. And that's the hope that I have.
Definitely.
I have faith. Anyway,
that's a reliable way to truth.
The next, oh god, Poppy is a nightmare. The next question is from Alec Maggio. What do you think?
Alec, hey.
Sorry if I got your.
I know Alec.
Okay. What do you think is the culprit for the lack of critical thinking? Is it our education or lack of experience and exposure? So
I think I have an answer.
Yeah.
Religious thinking. I think.
Do you think that
demonstrably
is the sole problem, the main problem, or just a problem in people being wrong about trans people?
At least in the US, yes, because I think the US is particularly religious, and what I think that does is validates people's belief that they don't have to be critical about their beliefs, that they can have a feeling or have a faith and interpret it how they want, and that's okay. And when you go home and it affects no one else, I might almost agree. The fact is, it usually impacts how you vote. It impacts how you interact with other people. Like, it impacts how you interpret information. It impacts so many things. People need to understand how to decipher what's true and what's not true. And I think, at least in the US, I do think religiosity is a huge culprit for why things are the way they are. I don't know if that's the same necessarily in the UK,
Well,
but
this is really interesting because I think recently the UK has got the nickname of Turf Island. And like you have things like Westboro Baptist Church and Donald Trump and like these absolute nutters who want to take away women's rights, LGBT rights. Like they just do not give a shit. They don't even hide it. I just want to take away abortion from people. I want to stop gay people getting married, and I want to ban trans people from existing. Like they'll just say that. And you have that, and you probably have thousands of people with that position, and they'll join the KKK and all this kind of madness. But then you also have a huge, like half the country basically. I mean, you're very split there, who hardline think the opposite of that. And I think there's this very like red-blue thing going on there. I don't know. I mean, I've never been to the USA, and perhaps you disagree with this. Whereas the UK, we don't have any of that, and we don't have religion so explicitly, like no one here is explicitly joining the KKK. We don't have anything like the Westboro Baptist Church. We don't have people saying, I want to end LGBT rights and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, we have such a transphobic establishment, like the media, the politicians, they're all kind of almost in lockstep. Like our left wing and our right wing press is all bullshit. Like it's so bad that, well, one example is the US Guardian wrote a letter to the UK Guardian calling them out for transphobia. And like the Guardian is one of our left-wing papers. And it's weird reading the news from America, because in America, when you get the news about like trans rights, they'll say things like, you know, trans people are discriminated against and some transphobic people think they shouldn't have rights. And like some newspapers will write that. Whereas in the UK, they'll be like, some people who are trans-identifying claim that they should have special rights, whereas feminists think otherwise. And like that's normal here. That's what you get from the most left-wing, progressive, trans-friendly papers. Well, they'll always both sides everything. They'll both sides literally everything. They'll say, oh, you know, trans people want access to healthcare, but there are concerns about detransition, as if they're 50-50. So here in the UK, I think that we've got some weird special case of a combination of lots of factors. I think perhaps we could do a whole video on why the UK is so institutionally, specifically the UK is so institutionally transphobic. But I don't think religion plays such a role, but if it does, it's probably a bit more of a background factor.
Right. Yeah, I think maybe also social media might somewhat exploit both of those factors, because yeah,
it's definitely a huge factor in it. Okay, have you got time for a few more questions? We're coming up to an hour and a half. Okay, cool.
I this is my weekend. I got nothing else going on. Not getting naked on camera tonight.
Well, yes, no, anyway. Okay, so Holly Lancaster Smith says, how do we move forward to make it so questioning if trans people are trans is wrong? That's an interesting question. I think that questioning... so when we say wrong, I mean, I guess that kind of makes it sound like it's a moral thing, or even like a sin, or like a position you shouldn't do. Like, you shouldn't walk up to like a disabled person and be like, justify why you should exist. Like, that's morally wrong. And we want a society where people don't do that, because it's just bullshit. Obviously, we do want a society where people don't walk up to trans people and say, you're a man, justify it to me, or you shouldn't be here, or you know, get out of my spaces, or whatever. Like, because they are immoral things to do. But I don't think we want to create a society where questioning things is wrong, or even considered moral at all. If you want to address the topic in your mind and consulting all the resources you have about whether women should be allowed to vote, like the answer is yes. And I know you can get there through skepticism. And I think any rational person, I'm not even remotely concerned that a rational person, given the evidence, would come to any other conclusion.
Mm.
But some do. And if we try and make that illegal to even question that, or we try and make it such a moral like taboo that you can't even ask questions. Sorry, I've taken the whole answer here. Would you like to comment?
No, I was actually going to say literally, I'm pretty much in the same ballpark, that I think I never want to create a environment or a situation where questioning anything is wrong. I think everything should be questioned. I think the issue comes with like when you're questioning whether against the evidence, whether trans people should be allowed to have access to healthcare or use restrooms. If you have a cousin or a son or a daughter or a parent, whatever, who's trans, and you're like, hey, like I know you, and I thought that, and based on what I know of you, I'm struggling to understand how you would come to that conclusion. Like, can you help me understand? I think that's totally appropriate. And I think you should have those conversations with your loved ones, like obviously respectfully. But yeah, I think the goal shouldn't be to have a world where questioning trans people is wrong. I think, I think questioning against without evidence, like if you come to me with like a claim like, hey, I saw the study that just came out that said like trans people do have an increased habit of assaulting people. Like, should we revisit this topic? Like, I want people to be comfortable doing that. I don't want people to go against the evidence. But
yeah, I think it's I mean, I would actually argue that questioning is more than just something we shouldn't stop. It's something we should encourage because like you don't end up being a racist because you're asking questions. Like that's a position you get into if you haven't asked enough questions and you haven't got enough of an open mind. And it's the same, like you do see people who call themselves skeptical, who are race realists or who are gender critical or whatever. And I feel like it's a little bit like of a local maxima. So like when you get on a graph, you know, you might have this little bit and you think, oh, like this is the highest point, so this is the truest thing. But actually there's this other huge peak over here and it's because you haven't asked enough questions. And it's the same with trans rights. I think a lot of people apply some basic skepticism. Oh, being trans is like being anorexic, therefore we should stop people from doing it.
Right.
That's not the symptom of someone asking too many questions. That's a symptom of someone not asking enough questions.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it kind of comes back to, you'll hear this if you enter into skeptic spaces a lot, about teaching people how to think, not what to think. I don't want people to say, like, trans rights is the objective thing, don't question it, shut up after that. I want people to ask the right questions and understand how to come to conclusions, how to find out if something's true. Whether or not something is true and how you know that should be an extremely important question to everybody all the time.
Yes, definitely. And I think the only way we can really get to the best result for everyone is getting enough people to do that. I mean, that's like this. The thing I find myself thinking, one of the things I find myself thinking the most in my battles with people online is, I wish they taught critical thinking at school.
Oh, like, I know.
Oh, it's just so
I remember in high school, like I would research this stuff, like philosophy on my own time and be like, oh, I wish I could learn this in high school. Like, it's so interesting to me. But yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, math, science, and English, all those things are really important subjects. But no, I think we don't do a good enough job giving equal access to good education, first of all, and then, to the right kind of tool. We don't give people the right tools to operate with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I actually got taught some critical thinking at school, but they only taught it to the people who had the highest marks. And I kind of feel like, well, they should teach critical thinking to everyone, but why are you only teaching it to the top of the class? Like, what does...
Yeah. It's like you have to have special privileges or have like a particular interest in science and research to like get that access, not like just be taught broadly those skills.
Exactly. Right, okay. I've got another question.
Yeah.
From Leisha Fox. I think that's how I would say it. Sorry if I got your name wrong. Do you encounter many people who change their transphobic viewpoint when identifying flaws and their reasons behind it? If you have an example, do you know what changed their mind?
Oh, I mean, I also don't think I engage with transphobic people on the amount that you do, Katie. I mean, like, I have a pretty transphobic family in a lot of ways. My mom, my stepdad, my immediate family is great, but like my dad and that side of the family, it's atrocious. Like
Sorry to hear that.
I've tried to approach it from every angle, and there are a lot of people who just like they just I don't know, they want to stay committed to their in group. They don't really care about truth or information. They just want to feel comfortable. So yeah, I'm not sure.
It's difficult. Well, I'm going to be some arrogant here. I actually get a fair amount of messages from people saying, I've changed my view because of you, or because of something you said, or you started me off thinking about this, or whatever.
I mean, that's how kind of I reached out to you too. It was like you kind of convinced me and of certain points, yeah.
Which is great, and like I feel honoured when people say that, and it's cool to know. I don't do what I do because of that, but it's nice. It's nice to hear from people because, like, I mean, ideally, I want to change everyone's mind, and that is like a noble goal to have. But actually, I just do it because I'm addicted to arguing. But I mean, this week's been a good week for actually. I've had 4 people message me in the last 7 days saying, I've changed my mind on this, partially thanks to you. So, I mean, I presume that for everyone who messages me, there's at least one who doesn't. So people do change their mind. I think that one good example is the person who called into the line last Sunday had a question, and maybe I don't know if their position was settled, but they definitely had a sort of a leaning towards one position, and I presented them with some ideas and they sort of changed their mind, and that's kind of what prompted this whole discussion. Is it was a skeptical person who's like, well, why should I believe any of this stuff about trans people? And I mean, here's the evidence, here's the reasoning, is kind of what I presented. So that doesn't really answer the question in like what specific things help the most. That's very difficult. I mean, lots of people have so many different routes to why they hold their transphobic position, and it is kind of case by case, which is very draining. I mean, I've had week-long conversations with people, 3 people, all with the same thing, and you get to the end of it, and 2 of them turns out that they were just leading you on and they didn't care at all, and it's like soul destroying. But that one person then might walk away with a slightly different view. Arguably, it's worth it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think like I have a harder time with like I haven't had as much success arguing on maybe necessarily trans rights, but like definitely I recommend people checking out like Street Epistemology with Anthony Magnabosco. That is an amazing resource for how to talk to people with deeply held beliefs generally. Like you're gonna find that. Yeah, I think you're gonna find that skill applies more to religious thinking than necessarily issues on trans rights or the existence of trans people in general. But I think those skills can be brought in because like we were saying earlier, like it's more effective to demonstrate to someone where their argument, their belief that they already hold is flawed than to say like, here's my belief or here's the evidence that I have. Like they're going to just dig in.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's something that perhaps I'm lacking on. Someone will say something that's false. They'll make 3 assertions, 2 of them contradict each other, all 3 of them are completely false, one of them's completely unrelated, and the conclusion they come to doesn't actually based on the premises. And I'm like, well, okay, so this is false, this is false, this is false, A and B are contradictions of each other, the 3 points don't lead to the conclusion. I mean, that's all true. Does it change anyone's mind? Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes all
throwing-
types too, right?
It
like
does.
like there are people who are really
Multi-pronged
convinced by that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I try not to ever give my emotional view. I think emotions is one of the best ways of changing people's mind, but it is the most draining one. Like, I could talk to 100
For sure.
transphobic people who think all trans people should be done away with all day. Like, without engaging emotionally, I can be like, no, this is factually incorrect. No, this is a logical contradiction. I can do that for ages. And then if someone comes to me and says, I'm concerned about trans rights because I have been sexually assaulted as a woman, and I'm like, oh, I have also been sexually assaulted as a woman, and maybe if I share my story with you, we can bond over this, and you can have more empathy for me, and I can have more empathy for you, and I do that, and 1 in 10 times that really breaks through with someone, and suddenly there's a whole new world to them if they haven't considered, and you have a great connection, and you can even be friends for life of it. But all the other times, like one out of those 10 times is at least half, probably, when you're talking to transphobes, is going to be someone who not only doesn't care, that's now a weapon they have against you. They're going to dig in about it. They're going to tell you it doesn't count, it doesn't matter, and it's going to absolutely wreck you emotionally. And although the emotional angle is good and it's good for friends and family, I just do not recommend it for strangers because it's just soul destroying.
Definitely.
Yeah. Right, let's see. My voice is kind of running out of energy, but we have a couple more questions if you're up for them.
Sure. Yeah, bring them on.
Okay. Right.
I'm glad we have more rolling in. That's great.
And this is most
glad I'm not such a boring guest now.
Well, I didn't say that anywhere. I mean, all these questions are just for me, so.
All right.
Right, let's see. Do either of you, so this is from Phoebe, do either of you have advice for people starting to get into activism?
I would say be very careful and be very smart about how you want to spend your energy in activism. I've done a few front lines, like counter protest things. And it's been pretty scary, honestly. Like, I went to the Straight Pride Parade in Boston. Can't remember if it was a year or two ago now.
Oh, when the Nazis marched through your town.
Yes. And the cops were assaulting people with their bikes, and it was terrifying. They attacked medics, like, completely unprompted. A bunch of us got maced from not even getting maced, but just they maced broadly, and it just went downwind and, like, hit us all.
And the American police are fucking shit.
Yeah, they're really bad. So I would say, especially if you're trans, the rights here around, like, where you go for prisons is not really great yet. So I would say be very, very, very careful and protect yourself. I think you can do a lot of activism from having conversations and doing things like this, where we're, like, having conversation on a broadcast. I think that is a great way to do some, like, front lines activism that's not going to get you arrested or assaulted or something like that. So I would definitely say don't feel guilty if you are afraid to be on the front lines. Like, do what you are capable of doing, and don't let anyone shame you for not feeling comfortable being on the front lines, because it's a real risk for trans people, especially in the US right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with all that. I don't know if I would really call myself an activist. I always feel kind of guilty. Like,
Same.
I mean, I know that the anti-trans people love to call every single trans person activist. If you're a trans person, you're like some 16-year-old kid and you're like, I just want to use the toilet. Suddenly you're an activist. Like, and that's a way of dismissing people. It's a way of dismissing people's views. They're like, oh, well, I like trans people, I just don't like the activists. But also, secretly,
those darn TRAs.
Secretly, I think every single trans person is an activist, apart from the 4 who agree with me. But I don't think I'm much of an activist, because all I do is argue on Twitter. And I know that does some things, and like I've said, some people have changed their mind from it. But, like, I know people who are, like, volunteering at shelters and in the front lines of protests and, visiting politicians and picketing things, and, like, they're they're better than me in that, and they're achieving more, and all this kind of stuff. But there's different things you're good at. I've been to a couple of protests, and I personally found them so depressing. Like the idea of standing there trying to get the attention from the media, who already don't give a shit because it's trans people, in desperation for your own rights, is so depressing. I know sometimes protests have a lively feel, but it's just horrible. I hate it. I absolutely.
It can be really degrading.
I really don't ever want to go to a protest again, and I will if I have to. But I hate them, and I hate like being a target. I hate people knowing who I am. So much of it I hate, but I just try and do what I'm good at, rather than what the best thing to do is, because I don't really know what the best thing to do is. I kind of want to be as safe as I can be. I think probably I've been a bit careless. I don't know. It's difficult. My advice would be small steps. Do what you're good at, and listen to other trans people.
Definitely.
Because if you're doing something like, sending pictures of naked trans people as an insult to transphobes or something, like, you might think that's funny, but it's not actually helping. Stop doing it. Yeah. Like the classic is when someone says someone's homophobic and you send them a gif of gay men kissing. It's like, it's kind of enjoyable, but kind of bullshit. It's not really, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, we've got someone in the chat. Nicholas Chop. I was one. Me. I changed my mind. Excellent. Good to hear from you.
Yay! That's awesome.
I think that's all of our questions. So, Megan,
cool.
We'll call it a day there because my voice is starting to wear out.
Yeah. But that was awesome. I felt like that was really productive.
Oh, Mega, do you have any points that you would like to do that we missed off your list? So I know kind of
I think so.
All over the place.
My compulsive self, there's literally highlighted too.
Yay.
No, none that are particularly important. I think the only one we didn't cover was, I think, an issue that I don't feel particularly passionate about. Is just, I think we maybe aren't so great in the trans community about calling out the bad arguments and the bad issues coming from our side. But I think there's a good reason for that, because those people, although their arguments are bad, are leading to the same end as us, whereas the people we're actively fighting want us to not exist and not have rights. And so, yeah, obviously that takes a way higher priority on the list. But like,
for sure, I actually think about this quite a lot. So like a classic example that comes up a lot, especially when I'm talking to gender critical women, particularly lesbians, is the idea of trans women saying you're transphobic if you don't like penises. And I could spend a lot of time like pushing this issue, and that actually I think I do spend a lot of time with it because they bring it up all the time and I actually hate it. There are people, like, it doesn't happen much, and they definitely overblow how much people have this opinion, and lots of them are false flag, like so many. I mean, I feel almost conspiracy theory person when I say this, but when you go and look up some of the accounts that they'll send you, like, what about this person who says, like, oh, if you're not a lesbian if you don't choke on deck or something, and then you go and look up their account and it's just some 4chan MRA or something. It's like, transparently it's not a trans person. Anyway, like, there are some people who say it, and I've encountered them before, and I've called them out publicly before, because I'm like, well, this is a bad position, and I want to make a point. It can get to the point where you're kind of just doing that, even if there's not much of it. And also, lots of them are just, I mean, most of it is like some 16-year-old kid who writes some tweet and they've got 18 followers, and then some 35k follower trans person who maybe they even know and kind of look up to or whatever, maybe being a bit arrogant, comes in to their tweet and says, no, you're a homophobe, And then all the gender critical people swarm around and be like, yeah, thanks for saying this, Katie. It's so good that you're calling out all of the and it's like, I've stopped calling them out publicly, not because what they're saying is wrong, but because DM is the way to go. Just be like, mate, this is wrong. Here is why. I'll talk through with you.
Agreed.
Stuff. And I will call it out publicly. And I will, and like any of these bad positions, and I do call out these bad arguments. Like sometimes people will say, I'm just trying to think of what's a bad argument for trans people.
I mean, I think that is a great one. That like genital preferences are somehow transphobic, or I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't know why none are jumping to mind, because there are literally like entire channels. No, but I mean, like, but you're right. There are just like entire channels of like whether trans people or whether they're a middle-aged cis man who like literally make entire channels about, oh, trans activists are so bad because I saw a tweet once. Like,
yeah. So for sure, I think maybe one example might be if a trans person says, "I'm a woman because I have a woman's soul." Like,
yes.
There are people where that is a good argument to them. I mean, I'm sure lots of people are won over with that argument. But there are going to be skeptical, to a degree, gender critical people, because I don't think you can get to gender critical from a skeptical angle, but who see that argument, and I'll shred that argument. I do not care at all. I mean, if someone says, what do you think of gendered souls? I'll be like, well, souls just don't exist. Like, I think there's enough evidence to make that assertion. And I will call people out who do it. And if there's some big trans account, you know, some huge one, like ContraPoints or something, who said, the best argument for trans people is that trans people have gendered souls, I'll be like, well, I'll be right in their comments. I'll quite tweet it, mate. I'll say this is wank.
Right.
So I do some of that, but yeah, like you say, you don't want to spend your whole time doing that. You end up being one of these like shitty people who's just calling out people on your own side and just causing all this infighting, when it's like a better way of doing it, rather than calling out people and constantly focusing on these shit arguments, is to just, when they come up, be like, well, this is why it's bad. Anyway, this is the argument that I need to make because it's more important.
Yeah. And I think pointing out that most of those arguments are like straw man arguments that like basically no one in the trans community holds. And like, I think that people on like the gender critical side maybe take advantage of those things, and that's something I want to stop.
They love it.
Yeah, I just like, but yeah, I agree. At the end of the day, I think it's far more useful to spend our energy debunking the arguments of gender critical people than necessarily trans people who are making bad arguments. But I do like to, like, I mean, it's kind of like atheists. Like I like to spend a lot of time making sure that like the arguments from our side are good, because like I believe we're on the right side of this issue, so I want us to be presenting it the right way.
Yeah, exactly. If like there was one today actually where some atheist had said, you can't be intelligent and religious, and lots of atheists I followed called that out because it's a bullshit position.
Right.
And I reckon you could possibly that isn't a mainstream atheist movement position. But it is a position that some atheists hold, because you can be an atheist without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I reckon probably you could create an atheist account or whatever and spend your whole life just attacking people who say this and attacking this idea. And you could generate all this content, and maybe some religious people would like you because although you're an atheist, you're calling out the bad things in the atheist community. But it's just not really useful. You want to say to atheists who come out with this, mate, that's junk. Fuck off. Now let's talk about why slavery is bad, because even though the Bible says it's good. Like, that's right. You know, that's how much attention you want to give these things.
Yeah, I think it's far more constructive to make good arguments and to publicly deconstruct the bad arguments, like when you're talking to gender critical people. I think that's going to be more convincing to the people who are already on our side, like at least vaguely.
Yeah, emotionally, but not logically, perhaps. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And I think a pro tip for any gender critical person who has absolutely no morals or integrity, who wants to destroy trans people, make a trans account on Twitter. Spend a year just retweeting bullshit and saying trans women are women or whatever. Get like 10,000 followers, and then just start tweeting things about internal struggles like, this is my opinion on genital preferences. This is what I think about like trans medicalism. And you'll create the discourse and everyone will be arguing amongst each other and they won't have time to argue about the actual issues because everyone has to have an opinion on these things.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway.
But yeah. But that was good. That was like the only thing. And I think, yeah, we are on the exact same page for that issue.
Wicked. Okay. Thank you very much for coming on. It's been really great to have you.
Yeah, it was fun.
I feel like we could talk about this loads more and perhaps we will do in the future.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's been really great. And thank you, everyone, for watching. Thanks for your questions. It was really great. I hope there's no sound issues. Thank you to the internet for not cutting out. Thank you to my computer for not blue screening. This is my cicada friend who is behind me.
Oh, so
sweet. And, yeah, wicked. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Cool.